Perfect. So today we are building this interface from Google Cloud. This is a call to action consisting of different links towards areas for support and also buttons towards the cloud platform or G Suite. And we're going to get started by creating our new project. So I'm starting with a blank project that I'm going to call AEF. AEF create project. Perfect. And the first thing that I'm going to do is to check on how large this content is in terms of the width of the container. So I'm going to create a element that I can use to measure this very roughly, like this. And I'm noticing that I'm having roughly 1200 pixels. So I'm creating my section that I'm going to call section AEF number 1. And inside of that, I'm creating my container number 1 that I'm going to have with this maximum width of 1200s, very roughly again. But I'm taking that measure from here on my X data sign. So I'm having a maxed width of 1200 pixels. I'm having my width to be 100% so that the element grows up to this maximum width that I'm setting, but it can shrink if the screens on which this UI are rendered get to be a little smaller than this 1200 pixels. So that is the why I'm setting the width as 100%, then max width as a fixed measure instead of having a fixed measure right in here as the width. Also, I'm spacing this to be centered or horizontally so that for very large screens, my container gets fit in, at the center of the UI. Now, back to the section that is wrapping up this container. I am going to have a little pattern. I very often use a rule of thumb of 80 pixels for right and left sides on desktop. However, I am going to check what the distance is between this element over here and the element at the top, and I'm having definitely more than 80 pixels. So I am just in order, or for the sake of having a little bit of symmetry, I am doing 1500s for the top and bottom padding like this. There we are. Now let's check the elements or the overall structure of this design. On the left hand side, I'm having this setup with two main areas, if I may call them that way. At the top, I'm having my buttons, which are at the same time distributed into two columns. At the bottom, I'm having a sort of disclaimer, and at the right, I am having another column, another column that I'm using for some links. So this column might be like that, or maybe like this. In this case, because of we were having this line over here that is fitting very nicely in between those two elements, I will assume that this column will get towards, or will correspond to this element only, instead of going towards this place. And thus, this over here might be something like this, distributed into two additional columns. There we are. Okay, so what I'm going to do is to have created an element that will contain everything in the top. Let's color code this as green. So I'm having a element that will contain everything up in here. Then another element that will wrap up everything in the bottom, or that's the only element at the bottom in the bottom. So inside of this container, I'm going to create my two div blocks. The one at the top will be named, I don't know, maybe box top AF number 1. And I'll call it similarly the one at the bottom, only this will be box bottom AF number 1. So I'm having the two main areas of my structure. Now, for the top one, I'll have two columns. So inside of this one, we'll create a div block that I'm calling top grid AEF number 1. And for that, I'm going to actually get a grid created on which I'll set this to be roughly 25 or 30%. So this one will become 30% of the width of this grid. And I'm having only one row for that column. So remember, this column over here is like comparing this sort of purple column in this mockup that I'm having, and I'll color code this like, let me just something that's a little different from the others. Perhaps it's this blue. So what I'm creating now is this left side bluish column or area, and this purplish side, right side area over here. So I'm having my bluish area in here that I will call top left, or top first area AEF number 1, and I'll call the other one top second area AEF number 1. Perfect. Now let's get inside of this top first area. Inside of this, I'm having one row containing this headline over here, right? And next, I'm having one row containing the other elements at the bottom. And those elements at the bottom consist of two columns, like those. Let me just get this color coded. It's something very different from what I previously used. Maybe this yellow will do. Okay, so I am creating this top area or sub area for the headline like that. So let me just get one div block created over here and get this to be top first heading AEF number 1, and in the bottom I will create a top first. This one I'll call it bottom area AEF number 1. So I'm having this top that will contain the heading, the title of this call to action, and those two columns will contain bottoms. So let me work on the headline first. I'll drop up a heading. Maybe this will be a H2. We actually don't know. We'll assume that because let's assume that our designer told us this is they want this to be a H2 headline, right? So I'm going to check next what the features are for this text. We're having 48 pixels for this text over here. Let me call this top first heading AEF number 1. Oh, top first headline AEF number 1. that will be have the margins that Webflow assigns for those headlines by default. I'm going to get those deleted, and I'm going to get those set to 0, and I'm going to make 48 pixels for the size 1.3 em for the height of the line. This 1.3 em is a measure relative to the 48 pixels that is set up in here. We'll find out this to be very useful for mobile, because if we reduce this to 22, we don't have to touch the height again. This will still be a proportional measure to whatever the size of the text is. So I really love to use em for the height of my text lines. Now I'm checking this to be regular, so I'm making this I'm turning this out to be regular, like that. Perfect. And let me just copy and paste the text that we're having for this particular headline. There we are. Now let's work on those 2 columns over here. We're having, let me get created a grid. Okay, so I'm creating a grid that I'm calling top first grid AEF number 1. Inside of that grid, I'm having only 1 row, but I'm having indeed 2 columns for those 2 groups of buttons. So I'm having 2 columns or sub elements created like this. Then I will call top first grid item AEF number 1. And actually, those 2 can totally and absolutely share these styles one with each other, because of they're pretty similar. So I'm having the very same class distributed into those 2 div blocks in here, meaning that whatever change I make in any of those, like say that I'm randomly going to have this color for the animal background, both divs will be affected because they are sharing the same class over here. So inside of this, I'm going to build now this substructure. At the top, I'm having a headline. At the bottom, I'm having 2 buttons, right? So I'm having a top and bottom set of elements created like this. Let me call this top first. I'm actually calling out everything inside here top first, so that it is easily to recognize later on when we are messing around with this structure over here, or a developer gets hand into this and kind of understand what we have done. So I'm calling this top first, grid top AEF, grid top wrapper AEF number 1. And I'm going to create another one for having the elements in here in the bottom, that I will call almost the same, only this time it is not grid top, but instead grid bottom. Notice what I have done here is to click the duplicate class on the class and to create a copy, a isolated copy of that class, then to rename it. It is just kind of a shortcut to quickly name classes that we are now are only having a very small difference in their names compared to others we previously created. So I'm creating now, I'm going to check now the features on this text over here. I'm having 22 regular, so I'm creating a text block that I'm going to call top first grid top heading AEF number 1. That will have 22 pixels on size, and we'll have 1.3 em on height of size. I'll care about color immediately, just to not forget that in within a few minutes. So I'm copying and pasting this color for this text line, and finally I will get this copied over here and paste over there. Perfect. Now inside of this one, I'm having two buttons like those in here. I'm having several ways to build this. One of those will be to create a grid. Just for the sake of making something different on this exercise, I will have this to be inside of a flex box. So instead of grid as property, I'm going to use flex as the property. So I'm going to drop this div block over here that I'm going to call top first, grid, button, wrapper, AEF number 1. And instead of having this to be a grid like this for having the two buttons on each cell, I'm going to have this to be a flex layout like that one, for which I'm going to make sure to have horizontal aligned to the top or to the start, justified to the start as well. And I'll set this to be children wrap, which means that whenever a button cannot fit into this space, which will probably happen when we're having a very small screen to view this content, the button that cannot fit into the same row will be immediately get above the other button. I'll show you in a few seconds. So I'm having my top first grid button over here. What I'm going to do next is to create a element for the button. Now what I need is a link. I can either go with a link block that is having some text inside, or to create a actual button. What I'm going to do here is to go for a button. I often do the other one because of it is kind of more flexible when you're having a button that has elements inside like icons or any other, but just for the sake of simplicity in this exercise, I'm going to go with a button element. So for this button, I'm going to copy or going to name this as top first button AEF number 1. So I'm having my first button. I'm going to check what the features are, or what the visual features are for this one. I'm having 44 height and having 3 as the measure for corner radius. I'm having this bluish color over here, so I'm making for this button height 44. I am making the background color for this button to be this bluish color, for which I'm going to create a swatch right now, and I'm having my border to be 3 pixels like that. Now the text inside of this button is 40 pixels regular, so I'm having 40 pixels. Notice, because of the default is 40 for my text, if I write 40 over here, it will just do nothing. Instead, I'm going to copy a random number, and then I'm going to write 40. For the height, I always use 1.3 em, or not necessarily 1.3, but it might be 1 point anything, but I often use em as the size. Now I'm going to have my padding to be 22 pixels. This is nothing the design will tell me, because of the buttons on the design are having plenty of space, but what I'm telling with those 22 pixels is, hey Webflow, please reduce this button up to 22 pixels padding. Do not go beyond that. Do not make something like this. So I'm having my 20 pixels over here. And also, let me just check what we have here. And also, actually, I'm going to have 44 pixels. Let me just check 25. I'm checking if, trying to see if there's some sort of consistency on the design. But no, there isn't. This is having almost 30. This is 28. This is 25, 24. So I'm going to just go for 20, 25. never expect my designer to deliver something pixel perfect to me. Neither I like that, because of, as a designer, maybe you will be more interested in this UI to actually work and to work properly, rather than worrying about if we're having 24.9 or 25 pixels in here. So I just kind of round all numbers all the time. Now I'm going to copy this and paste this here for my button. Next, I'm going to set a little bit of padding on the button to center this text over here, and that's it. Perfect. Now, what else do I have to do? I have to set up a little margin to the right and to the bottom on this bottom, so that when we are having two buttons, they're having kind of some separation in between them, like this. I'm having actually roughly 15 pixels. So here's what I will do. I'll create another button over here, and I'm going to have 15 pixels for margin at the right and 15 more as margin at the left, like that. Perfect. Okay, like this. Now for my wrapper, I'm going to do, I'll explain the why in a few seconds, but just try to follow me. I'm going to do a negative 15 pixels margin at the right and negative 15 pixels margin at the bottom, corresponding to the two margins that I created, values that I created for the elements inside of this wrapper. So here's why. What I'm telling with the wrapper to be children wrap is, hey, if this bottom is too large like this, have it to be wrapped below the first bottom. But if it is short enough as for it being next to this one, please have next that one. Now, what I'm doing next with the margin is telling, okay, and also I want you to have a 15 pixels in between the elements that are wrapped inside here. Now, why did we create a negative 15 pixels margin for the right and the top and the bottom in here in this wrapper? Because I want kind of eliminate or neutralize the margins that we're having here, so that they do not push elements outside the wrapper towards the right or towards the bottom. So this is kind of making a balance, and that's pretty much it. Let's now have a white button created. What I'm going to do here is I will assume that those two buttons are to be very well interlinked in terms of styles. So instead of creating a new class, what I'm going to do is to create a subclass to differentiate a little bit this second button. However, if your designer ever tell you, hey, I want those two buttons to be very, very independent, one of which other in terms of classes, what you will have to do is to create a new class for the second one button. So let's create a alt button as the second class for this one. And let's invert the colors. Let's have a white color for the background, and let's have a bluish color over here for the text, like that. Also, let's check this out, because we're having kind of some margin over here. Yes, indeed. And we're having this gray color for the margins. Now, here's the thing. If I create a margin over here of 1 pixel, that two additional pixels in the top and at the bottom will be added to the size of the button. And instead of having 44, I'm going to have 46 total as the visual height for the button. But if I do that in this alt button, I'm going to only affect this one. I want both those buttons to be equally equal in size. So I'm going to modify my margins, my borders into the main class instead of the class that is having an alternative or a subclass. Because if I do that in here, I'll only affect this combo of classes. So I'm going to jump towards this button over here. I'm going to set my border as solid as number 1. But for this particular button, I'm going to have my border to be blue. There we are. And for this one, I noticed that I'm having this one inherited the margin that the border that I created for the main class. So for this one, what I'm going to do is to have that border to be changed to this grayish color, for which I'm going to, by the way, create a swatch. There we are. So let's now copy and paste the text inside of this button over here, and we are done. So I'll just work very quickly on the styles or on the margins that we're having in between those elements, kind of in the vein of creating a little order or setting up a little order on my canvas. So I'm having roughly 60 pixels for this one in between this top heading, top first heading block and this top first bottom area. Next, I'm going to check what my distance is between this one and those buttons, and I have roughly 25 pixels. So I'm going to set this to be 25 pixels. I like to work rounded measures. Perfect. And that's it. So let's duplicate this one over here so that we have two combos of buttons. Let's copy and paste the text that we're having over here just for the sake of getting this to look as close as possible whenever efficient to the final design. See, this is done. Yeah, we're done. We're done. Okay. Perfect. Now, what do we have next? Let's check what we have in this column over here. We're having a line that is having this bluish gray color that is separating those two areas, and we're having this area over here that is having three call to actions or 3 links. So what I'm going to do here is to create a margin for this top second area here and a border for the left of 1 pixel, and with this color, right? Perfect. And also I'm going to set up a margin of approximately 60 pixels. I'm going to use 60 pixels over here. Let's see first how it looks like. Yeah, I think that it is going to do, but I'm going to do that as for now, and I will modify that on different responsive states if necessary. Inside of this area, I'll notice that I'm having 3, let's say, units of content, or yeah, let's call it units of content over here. So I'm going to create 3 blocks inside of that area, like this. I'm going to call those top second unit or item AEF number 1. Perfect. But also I'm noticing that it might be good for me to have a grid that contains those 3 areas. So inside of this top second item area that I just created will be inside of this one that will become a sort of grid system to contain those 3 elements. And that I'm going to call it top second grid AEF number 1. You might wonder why am I using this AEF. I really like to name my blocks with sort of a code that I can use for distinguish those from other elements that might be named very similarly. For instance, let's say that I'm creating another call to action that is having a section. So if I'm having those two just named as section, I'm not having any sort of way to differentiate one block from another. So this AEF is really helping me out with that task. Also, I like to organize my blocks. I have sort of a repo that I can access to for reusing elements in the future, and that makes my workflow very much more productive than if I didn't have this system. But anyways, this is just a very personal way to proceed with, and nothing that you have you should follow because of what I'm telling. And it's just I'm sharing this that is have proven to be very useful to me, and I hope that become very useful to you as well. So inside of my grid, I'm having those two blocks. I'm having this block. I'm sorry, that will contain those two elements. I'm having a text line and also a link. So I'm going to create just that. I'm dropping a text line, then I'm dropping a text link in here. This one I'm going to call it top second text line, AEF number 1. And the second one I'm going to call it top second item link, AAF number 1. That's it. Now let's check how those elements are built. I'm in 16 for the size of the text, and I'm having this grayish color for that text over here. So I'm having 16 1.3 EM for my height of the text line. I'm having this grayish color that I will have created as a swatch. And I think that this is also 16 indeed, for which I'm having this bluish royal color. So let's set this 16 as the size of the text. 1.3 EM might be good for the height of the line, and I'm having this bluish royal gel blue color. Notice that I'm having by default a underlined style on this link. So what I'm going to do is to hit this style decoration none option over here to delete it. And there we are. Let's copy and paste for the sake of having some nearby real content in here that we can evaluate on our HTML to actually get to know if it is working properly. I'm having a little bit of distance in between those two elements. That is roughly 10 pixels. So I'm having 10 pixels as the margin, as the bottom margin for my top second text line over here. And yes, so let me just now work on the other two items. So I will copy and paste over here. Perfect. I'm going to also check on what the distance is in between those elements, and we're having roughly 25 pixels. So I'm having the size of my grid gaps to be in between rows 25 pixels, just like that. And there we are. We're almost there. Now, on this screen size, those lines get to shrink. Maybe in more in larger screens we will have this to be different, but at very least in here it looks like 60 pixels might be too much for this design. So I'm going to reduce this to be 30 pixels, and I'm having my row gap in between columns to be 30 pixels as well, so that I have a distance that is equivalent or the same to the right that it is to the left. Now remember that negative margin that we have for our bottom wrappers over here. If we didn't have this, look at what will happen. We'll have additional 15 pixels to the right. So that is why we created that space margin over there. Now you might wonder, like, but hey, my designer provided me with this and I want to have roughly 60 pixels in between those two elements. So for that, you can just go towards a larger breakpoint. I don't know, maybe this one over here. Okay, and in there you can totally create 60 pixels to the right and have 60 pixels to the left, and there you are. Not a problem at all. But at the very least, in here on this desktop for this size and for the size that are a little to the bottom, we really should consider to make this visually appealing and comfortable for smaller screen sizes. Okay, so what is next? We're having this element kind of centered. We could assume that it is kind of centered. We actually don't know. Maybe it is aligned to the top, but with only a couple tenths of margin to the top. But let's just assume that this is, yeah, let's assume that we're having a panel of, say, 15 pixels to the top and maybe 15 pixels to the bottom, like this. So let's just get that assumed. And on larger screens, we'll have a design that is kind of more similar to what we have here. Perfect. Hence, when you're working and you want these tiles to be inherited towards the smaller screens or the larger ones, you should definitely work all the time on desktop. It might be very usual that you get confused and start modifying things in here in this bigger breakpoint, and then you realize, like, oh, I am not working over here, I have lost my work, I have to repeat all of these tiles that I set in here on desktop. So it is a error that happens to me all the time. It is quite a useful thing to remember, and hey, where am I working? I am on desktop. Perfect. So finally, we're going to work on this row over here, this row at the bottom, for which we'll have a grid system embedded inside like this, and we're calling this. Let me just check out. How did we call that? So the elements in here we called top grid. So what I'm going to do is to have consistency and call this bottom grid. AEF number 1. And inside of this, or this grid will be set to have only one row, 2 columns, and just like I did above, I'm having 30% for my right hand side row, or cell, I'm sorry, like this. Perfect. So what I'm basically doing is to have a empty space over here to have the text at the left to be wrapped in here. Notice that I am assuming this. My designer might have in mind this text to occupy the entire width of the row, but for the sake of this exercise, I'm just assuming that my designer wanted this to be limited, this text to be limited to this area over here. So inside of this row, I'm going to create, inside of this grid, I'm going to create my bottom grid item number 1. And inside of it, I'm going to drop off my text like this. and this is a text block that I'm going to call bottom text AEF number 1. Let's check on the styles. We're having 12 pixels, and we're having a little bit of separation in between characters. So I'm having 12 pixels, 1.3 or 1.6 might do better if this is going to become a paragraph in the future. We don't know actually, but let's try to make this as flexible as possible. 1.6 will tell the spaces in between the lines to be a little bigger than 1.3, which is pretty good for improving readiness on paragraphs. And next we are copying our text over here. Oopsie. There we are. And finally, let's check on what the distance is in between the area at the top and the area at the bottom. We're having roughly I'll have 100. Yeah, let's use 100 pixels in between those two areas. So I'm having my margin set towards the area that is, or the block that is next to it, instead of, I don't know, I'm not setting this margin to be in here, for example. Like, I'm not having my margin of 100 pixels on this element, because of that is not the element that is next to the element I want to separate this one from. But I'm having my margin be created in between the elements that I want my margin to be. So I'm having this at the bottom of the top element, and there we are. So what is next is to work on responsive states, which I'm going to do in my next video. Stay tuned.